It was October 14th, 1758. While the sun still slumbered, the silence of dawn was shattered by a surprise attack that would alter the course of history. Frederick the Great, one of history's most brilliant strategists, was about to make a mistake that nearly destroyed his army. What happened at the Battle of Hochkirch? Why did Frederick ignore the warnings from his generals? And how did the Austrians achieve such a devastating victory? The Battle of Hochkirch stands as one of the most dramatic episodes of the 7 Years' War, a conflict that shaped the destiny of Europe's great powers. On one side stood Frederick the Great, King of Prussia, renowned for his military genius. On the other, Leopold von Daun, the Austrian commander, famous for his caution and defensive mindset. But on that fateful day, Daun would do something nobody expected: launch a daring surprise attack before daybreak. In the darkness before dawn, as Prussian soldiers slept in their tents, Austrian troops silently surrounded them. The coming hours would witness one of Frederick's greatest failures, a disaster that could have ended his reign and Prussia's ambitions forever. How could a commander as experienced as Frederick have been so blindsided? What secrets did Daun uncover to achieve what seemed impossible? If you love history and want to unravel the mysteries of the great empires, like this video, subscribe to Modern Age Chronicles and don't miss a single episode. Join us as we explore the battlefield decisions, tactical blunders, and brilliant maneuvers that changed the fate of nations. The story of Hochkirch isn't just about military strategy. It's about human pride, the cost of overconfidence, and the thin line between triumph and catastrophe. To truly understand the Battle of Hochkirch, we need to step back and examine the broader context of the 7 Years' War. This wasn't just any conflict, it was essentially the First World War, raging across 5 continents from 1756 to 1763. At its heart in Europe was an ambitious ruler with grand designs, Frederick the Great of Prussia. Frederick had transformed Prussia from a minor German state into a formidable military power, but his ambitions created powerful enemies. He faced what seemed an impossible situation, a massive coalition of Europe's strongest nations aligned against him. Austria, eager to reclaim its lost territory; France, the dominant continental power; and Russia, with its seemingly endless supply of soldiers. Together, they sought to crush the upstart Prussian kingdom and restore the old balance of power. The prize they fought over? Silesia, a wealthy province with rich mineral resources and a developed textile industry. Frederick had seized this valuable territory from Austria during the War of Austrian Succession, and Maria Theresa, the Austrian empress, was determined to take it back. This territorial dispute became the central battleground of the conflict in Europe. What made Frederick's position so precarious was the sheer mathematics of the situation. Prussia had a population of barely 5 million people, while the coalition against him commanded the resources of over 70 million. The Prussian army, though excellently trained, was outnumbered nearly 3 to 1. Military experts across Europe believed Prussia's defeat was only a matter of time. Did you know that at Hochkirch, Frederick lost over 30% of his entire army in a single morning? The battle was so devastating that 5 of his generals were killed, and he lost all his artillery and supplies. For context, imagine losing almost a third of your country's fighting force, along with much of its leadership and equipment, in just a few hours. This was the scale of disaster Frederick faced that October morning. What makes this even more remarkable is that despite this catastrophic defeat, Frederick would somehow recover and continue fighting for 5 more years. The Battle of Hochkirch reveals not just Frederick's rare moment of tactical blindness, but also his extraordinary resilience in the face of disaster, a quality that would define Prussia's survival through this existential struggle. Frederick the Great and Leopold von Daun could hardly have been more different as military commanders. Their contrasting personalities and approaches to warfare created one of the most fascinating rivalries of the 18th century. Frederick was the embodiment of audacity and innovation. Known throughout Europe as a military genius, He had revolutionized warfare with his famous oblique attack, striking the enemy's flank with overwhelming force while refusing his own weaker wing. He moved with lightning speed, believing that boldness was the key to victory. Frederick despised caution, once famously declaring, "He who defends everything defends nothing." His aggressive style had brought Prussia stunning victories against seemingly impossible odds, earning him the title the Great, even during his lifetime. Standing opposite this whirlwind of aggressive energy was Field Marshal Leopold Joseph Graf von Daun, the commander of Austrian forces. Where Frederick was bold, Daun was methodical. Where the Prussian king sought battle, the Austrian marshal preferred careful maneuvering. Contemporaries described Daun as deliberate and cautious to a fault, a commander who would never risk his army unnecessarily. This caution had frustrated Frederick for years. The Prussian king would march aggressively toward Daun, seeking decisive battle, only to find the Austrian commander slipping away or taking up unassailable defensive positions. Frederick mockingly called Daun the old hesitator and believed he could always predict the Austrians' conservative moves. What's fascinating is that Frederick and Daun had faced each other many times before Hochkirch. At the Battle of Kolin in 1757, Daun had actually handed Frederick his first major defeat by patiently waiting in a strong defensive position and letting the overconfident Prussians exhaust themselves in frontal attacks. Frederick should have learned then not to underestimate the cautious Austrian. The psychological dimension of their rivalry is crucial to understanding Hochkirch. Frederick's repeated successes had bred in him a dangerous contempt for Daun. He simply couldn't imagine the methodical Austrian commander would ever launch a surprise night attack, something so contrary to Daun's established pattern. When his generals warned that the Austrians might attack their vulnerable position at Hochkirch, Frederick dismissed them, saying, "The Austrians deserve to be hanged if they don't attack us here, and we if we allow them to." But at Hochkirch, Daun would finally turn the tables. The cautious commander had been studying Frederick's weaknesses and waiting for the perfect moment. When he saw the Prussian army camped in a vulnerable position, overconfident and with exposed flanks, Daun decided to do the unexpected. The man known for defense would launch one of the most perfectly executed surprise attacks in military history, proving that sometimes the most predictable opponent can deliver the most shocking surprise. In the pre-dawn darkness of October 14th, 1758, a thick fog blanketed the hills around Hochkirch. The Prussian camp lay mostly silent, with tired soldiers sleeping after weeks of marching. Frederick had positioned his army on a ridge near the village, with his right flank anchored by the church at Hochkirch. The king himself slept in a nearby manor house, confident that the cautious Daun would never risk a night attack. But Frederick had made a fatal miscalculation. For days, his generals had been warning him about the danger. The brilliant Field Marshal James Keith had openly declared, "If the Austrians leave us unmolested in this camp, they deserve to be hanged." Frederick's own brother, Prince Henry, had pleaded with him to move to a more defensible position. Frederick dismissed them all. His fatal pride wouldn't allow him to believe that Daun would ever attempt something so bold. While the Prussians slept, Austrian troops had been moving silently through the fog and darkness. Daun had meticulously planned every detail of the attack. 8 massive columns of Austrian and Croatian troops crept forward in complete silence. No talking, no smoking, no clanking equipment. The soldiers had even wrapped cloth around their boots to muffle their footsteps. By 5 o'clock in the morning, 80,000 Austrian troops had completely surrounded the Prussian position. The attack began with perfect coordination. At exactly 5:30 in the morning, a single cannon shot pierced the darkness. Immediately, the Austrians surged forward from all directions, led by specially selected grenadier units. The Prussian outposts barely had time to fire a shot before being overwhelmed. The first target was the church at Hochkirch, where the Prussian artillery was parked. The scene that followed was one of complete chaos and confusion. Prussian soldiers tumbled from their tents, half-dressed and disoriented, desperately trying to form battle lines, while Austrian grenades exploded around them. Many were cut down before they could even grab their weapons. The darkness and fog made it impossible to determine where the attack was coming from. It seemed to be everywhere at once. Frederick himself was rudely awakened by an aide who burst into his quarters shouting that the army was under attack. At first, the king refused to believe it. "Impossible!" he reportedly exclaimed. "It's just another false alarm." By the time Frederick finally mounted his horse, Austrian grenadiers had already captured Hochkirch church and turned the Prussians' own cannons against them. What followed was a desperate struggle for survival. The disciplined Prussian army, known for its drill precision and battlefield order, was reduced to isolated pockets of resistance, fighting blindly in the fog. Key commanders fell in rapid succession. Field Marshal Keith, who had warned of this very disaster, was shot through the heart while trying to retake Hochkirch village. Prince Francis of Brunswick was killed by a cannonball. General von Geist died, leading a counterattack. The Prussians were being slaughtered by an enemy they could barely see. Hey, did you know that Frederick himself nearly became a prisoner during this battle? At one point, he was riding with just a small escort when they accidentally galloped straight toward Austrian lines in the fog. Only a last-second warning from an alert aide allowed the king to veer away just moments before capture. If Frederick had been taken prisoner that morning, the entire history of Europe might have changed in an instant. If you're enjoying this deep dive into military history, make sure to hit that like button, share this video with fellow history enthusiasts, and subscribe to Modern Age Chronicles for more incredible stories from the past. And let us know in the comments, do you think Frederick underestimated Daun deliberately, or was his famous tactical genius simply blinded by pride? I'd love to hear your thoughts on this pivotal moment in European history. By mid-morning on that fateful October day, Frederick the Great faced the unthinkable, total defeat. The situation appeared hopeless. His army was in disarray, his artillery captured, 5 of his generals dead, and Austrian forces pressed in from all sides. Yet what happened next revealed why Frederick truly deserved his title, the Great. Not for his victories, but for his resilience in the face of catastrophe. As the morning fog finally lifted, Frederick personally took command of what remained of his shattered army. Displaying remarkable coolness under fire, he rode along the lines, rallying his men and organizing a fighting retreat. The famous Prussian discipline, drilled into soldiers through thousands of hours of training, now paid dividends. Even in defeat, the Prussian infantry formed their squares and began a methodical withdrawal, turning to fire devastating volleys whenever Austrian cavalry approached too closely. The retreat itself was a masterclass in military leadership. Frederick positioned his remaining cavalry on the flanks to protect the infantry, while personally directing rearguard actions with the battalions that had maintained their cohesion. Field Marshal von Seydlitz, perhaps Prussia's greatest cavalry commander, performed miracles that day, launching charge after charge to keep the Austrian pursuers at bay. By early afternoon, Frederick had extracted most of his remaining forces from the trap at Hochkirch. Here's an astonishing fact. Despite losing nearly 9,000 men killed, wounded, or captured, Frederick managed to retreat in good order to a new position at Bautzen, just 6 miles away. More remarkably, he did so while transporting his wounded with him. Frederick refused to abandon his injured soldiers to the enemy, an uncommon act of loyalty for the time. Even more surprising was Daun's reaction to his victory. The Austrian commander, true to his cautious nature, failed to aggressively pursue the retreating Prussians. After such a decisive victory, most generals would have pressed their advantage to potentially end the war. Instead, Daun allowed Frederick precious time to regroup. When an aide congratulated Daun on his victory, he reportedly replied, "The battle is won, but we must wait until tomorrow to see what we have gained by it." By the time Daun acted, The opportunity for a war-winning knockout blow had passed. Frederick wasted no time in rebuilding his shattered army. Within days, he had linked up with a secondary Prussian force under General von Retzow. New artillery was requisitioned from Dresden, and Frederick began the difficult task of integrating fresh recruits with his veteran soldiers. The king himself appeared tireless, writing in a letter, "We are beaten, but we are not destroyed. We will recover and fight again." The psychological impact of Hochkirch on Frederick is fascinating. Rather than breaking his spirit, the defeat seemed to temper it like steel. In his personal writings, Frederick acknowledged his mistake in underestimating Daun, writing, "There are times when the greatest skill consists in knowing how to moderate one's talents." He had learned a harsh but valuable lesson about overconfidence. Throughout the bitter winter months of 1758 to 1759, Frederick methodically rebuilt his army while keeping Daun's forces at bay through strategic maneuvering. By spring, the Prussian army had recovered much of its fighting strength. When the new campaign season began, Frederick demonstrated that Hochkirch had not diminished his aggressive spirit. If anything, it had refined it with a new wisdom about the dangers of underestimating one's opponents. The Battle of Hochkirch ultimately proved to be not the end of Frederick's campaigns, but merely a painful chapter in a longer story. Like all truly great commanders, Frederick had learned more from his defeat than from his many victories. The lesson would serve him well in the desperate years of fighting that still lay ahead. Historians across the centuries have unanimously ranked Hochkirch among Frederick's greatest blunders. The battle stands as a stark reminder that even military geniuses can fall victim to their own success. Frederick had won so many improbable victories that he began to believe in his own invincibility. This fatal pride cost him dearly. Nearly 9,000 casualties, his entire artillery train, and some of his finest generals. But beyond the immediate military consequences, Hochkirch left a more profound legacy, both for Frederick personally and for military thinking more broadly. For Frederick himself, Hochkirch marked a turning point in his approach to warfare. Before the battle, he often acted with reckless aggression, taking enormous risks that defied conventional military wisdom. After Hochkirch, a new dimension of caution entered his calculations. He remained bold, that was his nature, but now tempered that boldness with greater respect for his opponents. In his later campaigns, you can see this maturity in action. The same brilliant maneuver warfare, but with more careful reconnaissance and fewer assumptions about enemy intentions. What's particularly fascinating is how Frederick transformed the narrative of Hochkirch in his writings. In his personal histories of the 7 Years' War, he acknowledged the defeat, but subtly shifted blame to subordinates and circumstances. This wasn't merely self-serving, it was essential propaganda. Prussia was fighting for its very existence against overwhelming odds. Frederick could not afford to appear fallible to his people or his enemies. There's a remarkable story that after the battle, when news of the defeat reached Berlin, panic spread throughout the city. People feared the war was lost. Frederick responded by writing letters describing the battle not as a catastrophe, but as a temporary setback, brilliantly managed. One Prussian minister commented, "His Majesty has lost a battle, but he writes about it as if he had won one." This ability to control the narrative was as important to Frederick's survival as his military skill. The battle also cemented Leopold von Daun's reputation in military history. Though often overshadowed by Frederick in historical accounts, Daun's perfect execution of the surprise attack at Hochkirch is studied in military academies to this day. It demonstrates how patience and careful planning can overcome even the most brilliant opponent. Daun's willingness to adapt his natural caution and strike boldly when the moment was right reveals a flexibility that Frederick had fatally underestimated. Perhaps the most enduring legacy of Hochkirch is what it teaches us about leadership and failure. Frederick's response to defeat revealed his true greatness more than any of his victories. Within hours of the disaster, he was already planning his next moves, writing to his brother Henry, "Daun has played me a trick today, but we will continue the game." This resilience in the face of catastrophe, this refusal to accept defeat, was the quality that ultimately saved Prussia. There's a powerful lesson here that resonates far beyond military history. True greatness isn't about never failing. It's about how you respond when you do fail. Frederick could have withdrawn into despair after Hochkirch. Many generals would have. Instead, he acknowledged his mistake, learned from it, and continued fighting against what seemed impossible odds. In the end, Frederick's greatest victory wasn't any particular battle. It was simply surviving the 7 Years' War with Prussia's territory intact. Against a coalition that should have crushed him, he endured. And moments like Hochkirch, painful as they were, forged the resilience that made that survival possible. Military historians often ask, would Frederick have ultimately prevailed in the 7 Years' War without the harsh lesson of Hochkirch? We'll never know for certain. But what we do know is that from the ashes of his greatest defeat emerged a more formidable commander, one who combined brilliant tactical genius with a new respect for the unexpected. And in that transformation lies the true legacy of that blood-soaked morning at Hochkirch. The Battle of Hochkirch stands as a powerful reminder that even the greatest military minds are not infallible. Frederick the Great, the brilliant strategist who revolutionized warfare and built Prussia into a European power, made a catastrophic error in judgment. His dismissal of intelligence reports, his contempt for his opponent, and his overconfidence in his own abilities led to one of the most devastating defeats of his career. In the cold October dawn of 1758, these flaws nearly destroyed everything he had built. Yet perhaps the true measure of greatness isn't found in never making mistakes, but in how one responds to them. In the aftermath of Hochkirch, we see Frederick at his most remarkable, not as the invincible tactical genius, but as the resilient leader who refused to accept defeat. Within hours of watching his army shattered and his closest generals killed, he was already planning his next move. While his enemies celebrated, Frederick was rebuilding, adapting, and preparing to fight again. There's a fascinating letter Frederick wrote just days after the battle, where he confessed to a friend, "Fortune has turned her back on me. I ought to have expected it. She is a female, and I am not gallant." Even in his darkest hour, his wit remained intact. This resilience, this ability to acknowledge disaster without surrendering to it, is what ultimately preserved Prussia through its most desperate years. The story of Hochkirch also raises profound questions about the nature of military genius. Was Daun's victory merely luck, catching Frederick in a moment of uncharacteristic carelessness? Or was it the culmination of patient strategy, the cautious commander studying his flamboyant opponent and waiting for precisely the right moment to strike? The debate continues among historians to this day. What do you think? Was Daun's triumph at Hochkirch the result of fortunate timing, or was it a masterpiece of strategic patience? Was Frederick's error an anomaly in an otherwise brilliant career, or did it reveal a fundamental flaw in his approach to warfare? The Battle of Hochkirch reminds us that history isn't simply a parade of great names and dates. It's a complex human drama filled with pride, miscalculation, resilience, and redemption. Even the greatest figures of the past were not mythic heroes, but flesh and blood humans, capable of both brilliant insight and catastrophic error. If you've enjoyed this deep dive into one of history's most fascinating military encounters, please take a moment to like this video and share it with fellow history enthusiasts. Subscribe to Modern Age Chronicles for more content that brings the dramatic stories of the early modern era to life. From the battlefields of Europe to the courts of distant empires, we explore the events and personalities that shaped our world. Leave your thoughts in the comments section below. I'd love to hear your perspective on Frederick, Daun, And the lessons of Hochkirch. Was it luck, strategy, or something else entirely that shaped this pivotal moment? And let us know what other historical events or figures you'd like us to explore in future videos. Thank you for joining me on this journey through one of history's most dramatic battlefield reversals. Until next time, this is Modern Age Chronicles, where the past comes alive.